Hello everyone, I am Silvia Filippi, postdoc researcher at the University of Perugia and member of the editorial board of Diritti Comparati. I am very pleased to welcome Professor Adrienne Stone, who kindly accepted to give a short interview for our blog. Adrienne Stone is Melbourne Laureate Professor and Director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies at Melbourne Law School. She researches in the areas of constitutional law and theory in Australia and globally, freedom of expression and academic freedom. She has published widely on these topics. She teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and freedom of speech. She is a founding general editor of Comparative Constitutional Studies and an editor-in-chief of forthcoming Elgar Encyclopedia of Constitutional Law. The immediate past president of the International Association of Constitutional Law, a former vice president of the Australian Association of Constitutional Law, an elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and the Australian Academy of Law. Among her publications, she is a co-author of Open Minds, Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech. She is co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of the Australian Constitution and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Freedom of Speech. Professor Stone, you are one of the most eminent constitutional scholars studying freedom of speech. In your opinion, what are the most controversial aspects of freedom of speech today, in a context characterized by new threats to democracy and new challenges linked with the advancement of digital platforms?
So I think the challenges to freedom of speech today are just really profound. I think it's really true to say that we're dealing with a new speech environment, a new speech economy, that speech is just occurring in quantities and in forums that we've never seen it before. And we've lost our capacity to understand the speech that comes before us. So we've lost our capacity, or at least it's greatly degraded, to be able to do basic things like tell truth from falsity, know which sources to trust and not to trust. And I think that this is really dramatically undermining democracy all over the world. So it's not an exaggeration, I think, to talk about freedom of speech, or rather speech, public discourse, to be part of the infrastructure of democracy. But I think it's becoming increasingly evident that the way we've been thinking about regulating speech just can't keep up with the technological changes of the digital age. And so I think we really do need to reconceptualize how we understand the relationship between public discourse and democracy. And the old ways of thinking about freedom of speech are actually not well adapted to doing that.
Thank you. You have also focused your research on academic freedom. If and how freedom of expression and freedom of research are related? And what do you think on the recent debate arising in particular among scholars of constitutional law concerning scholarly activism, especially referring in the case of scholars channeling their activism through scholarly work?
Okay, so I'll say just something a little bit more about freedom of speech and connect it to academic freedom before moving on to that question about scholarly work. So look, one of the things that I've just said is I think our understanding about freedom of speech is profoundly challenged by the digital age. And one of the things I think we need to start doing is to be thinking about freedom of speech as a structural principle of democracy, rather than through an individual rights frame. So we actually need to be thinking more carefully about what is the kind of public discourse that we need to have a properly functioning democracy, and think less about its connection to the rights of the individual. I think academic freedom is probably similar. So one of the reasons, now let me say first of all, I think it's quite distinct from freedom of speech in some ways, although there's some overlap. And in fact, the reason I got into writing about academic freedom was I very often had colleagues contacting me because of my interest in freedom of speech, saying, I think I've got a free speech problem. And then they'd tell me what it was about. And I think, no, that's not a free speech problem. That's an academic freedom problem. So I'm certainly with a group of scholars who think that academic freedom is quite a distinct principle that is there not directly to support public discourse, but to support the distinct social role of the university. And the distinct social role of the university is the advancement of knowledge through teaching and research. So I think that's what academic freedom is there for. It's there. It is in some ways much narrower than freedom of speech, and in some ways I think it needs to be protected even more strongly. Now, the connections, I think, lie in what I've just said about freedom of speech. So I think we need to start thinking about academic freedom not as the individual right of a professor, but as a structural principle which is there to ensure that universities can perform their social role. And that is the advancement of knowledge through teaching and research. Now, that has a democratic function, right? Democracies need these institutions that provide them with informed, engaged citizenry and with the knowledge that you need to make a complex society function. But all of this, I think, needs to be thought about more structurally than through a rights frame. Would you like me to say something also? You asked me as well about scholarly activism.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, so I was thinking about that through partly because of my interest in academic freedom. And I should say, first of all, that, I really believe that we need to take a very institutionalist look at the problems that we're facing. So, and I've said in my work on scholarly activism that the most important thing we can do to ensure that scholars can function properly is actually to be really attentive to the health of the environments in which we function. So we need universities that protect our academic freedom, for example, so that we can do our work. But some of my work also has been about the individual ethics of the scholar. And they are important because there's only so much that you can regulate through law or that you can structure through an institution. And I am amongst those scholars who reject a sharp distinction between scholarly and activist work. But at the same time, I think that puts very considerable obligations on scholars to ensure that they resist any temptation to pull their scholarship away from the most fundamental mission, which is the advancement of knowledge through teaching and research. There are lots of distracting things. You want to build your career, you want to maybe make a name for yourself, maybe you want to change something in the world. And all of those things are okay as long as your scholarly independence is maintained. And universities have a big role in making sure that we have an environment where we can operate independently. But in the end, we also just need a strong, internalized personal ethics. And that's what that work has been devoted to showing.
Thank you so much for your reflection on this very, very interesting topic. And among other things, the president of the International Association of Constitutional Law, what were the biggest challenges for you in coordinating and managing such an important association?
So I was a president until December 2022. So I'm no longer the president. I was a president for 4.5 years or so. The challenges were intimately related to also the real rewards of the job. I have to say that being associated with the International Association of Constitutional Law changed my life and changed the way that I looked at the world and the way that I looked at constitutional law. I was just enormously privileged to be able to engage on a really deep level with scholars from so many other countries, and to do so in an association that has a really deep and profound commitment to pluralism. So the International Association was founded in the late 1980s as initially a way to bridge Eastern and Western Europe as the democratization before democratization in Eastern Europe began. Originally, it was actually a link across the Iron Curtain, and then it became a bridge between these very diverse societies of Eastern and Western Europe, and then it grew from there to become truly global. But one of its central commitments has remained that it ought to be a forum in which all kinds of people interested in constitutionalism can come together, no matter how diverse. Now, because of that, the association has what I think is a very fine and honourable history of engaging with scholars, even from quite illiberal regimes, very often to provide them with support, but also to take seriously the promotion of constitutionalist discourse all through the world. Now, that's the reward, but then came the challenges. With an association that is as diverse as that, overseeing it and leading it required a really deep commitment to a real open-mindedness, a willingness to really listen to others and to see the world from their perspective. And so you had to negotiate deep differences of constitutional tradition, legal tradition, and also of academic and scholarly traditions to engage with other scholars. And I thought that was so interesting, but of course it was very challenging. And there were times when we disagreed profoundly and we had to negotiate that. So I think that was really the main challenge. I also had to, in an emergency basis, brush up on my French. And that was also challenging, but very good for me. I'm actually really proud of the fact that the association is multilingual, because I think it reminds us, especially in the Anglosphere, to have some humility towards the rest of the world, about our own position in the world, and it helps remind us that not everybody sees the world in the same way. So staying true to that commitment to pluralism was the hardest, but it was also the best part of being the association's president.
Thank you for telling us about your experience. And that brings us to the next question. What topics would you advise young comparatists to explore?
Well, I have a couple of pieces of advice. I guess my most fundamental one is to pursue what's interesting to you. If something is interesting to you, you probably have the capacity to see in it what's really important and to bring attention to it. And that is really the beauty of being a scholar, is that you have the capacity to follow what's interesting to you. And that may not be the trendy topic du jour. And sometimes it can take a little bit of self-confidence to pursue research in an area where it seems that maybe others aren't. But I actually really think you should follow what truly interests you, and that's the way you're likely to do your best work. So that can be very diverse. I think also that as you grow as a scholar, one thing that happens very often is that you're invited into other people's projects, make contributions to other people's edited collections and volumes and those sorts of things, collaborate on things. And I absolutely think that collaboration is important and very, very good for us. But I think it's important not to allow the pressure to engage in that kind of collaboration to take you away from your singular vision. It's when I look back on the work that I've done through my career that I think has ended up being most important. It's often been the thing that just grabbed me. Nobody else was particularly working on it, but it struck me as something that just needed to be done. And that's been incredibly important. So I think I would advise younger scholars to really reflect on what's interesting to them and what seems important to them and to pursue that. The other thing that I would say, especially to scholars who come from jurisdictions that are outside of what we sometimes in the field call the usual suspects jurisdictions. So if you work in a country that's smaller, maybe considered less important internationally, I would say don't abandon working on your own jurisdiction. So I work in Australia, which is just a long way from anywhere. And well, not anywhere, but it's a long way from much of the world. And I think it's a constitution that is considered old and not terribly interesting and sort of unfashionable. And it is tempting, therefore, to kind of veer away from its study. But I think that there would be scholars in many parts of the world who might think about that, about their constitution, that maybe it's too small or too unusual to be really interesting. I would say to those scholars, keep working on your own constitution and do it for two reasons. One is your society needs to understand itself. It has its own problems and its own story and its own identity, and that's important. But also, bringing that knowledge to the world is something you should do. And certainly in the later part of my career, I've really begun to realize that there's a lot that the world could learn for looking at our funny old constitution that we have in Australia. And that one thing as Australian scholars should be doing is bringing that to the world as well. So I guess they're my two pieces of advice. Don't do what interests you, not what you think you should do. And particularly in some of the less studied jurisdictions, keep working on those problems and bring the insights of your system to the world, because it will be good for everybody else.
Thank you so much for your helpful advice for everyone who think about research in constitutional law. And now, as a last question to conclude, what are you currently working on, and what are your plans for your future researches?
So it was really good you asked me this question, because I thought I'd better write it all down. And there's too many things. So let me say, first of all, true to what I just said, I actually have returned from a period of doing more comparative work to working on my own constitution for a bit. And there is a group of scholars in Australia who have been working on understanding our constitution a little bit differently. It's often considered to be, because it's a 19th century constitution, sort of old-fashioned and not very interesting to the rest of the world. I think we underrate it. I think that it is, in fact, a framework for a very strong, progressive form of government, and that we would be better in the world, or in Australia, if we understood that better, and in the world. So that reinterpretation of the Australian Constitution is one thing I'm working on. Secondly, I'm continuing my work on academic freedom and thinking about the place of universities in democracy, and really asking myself, what does constitutionalist thinking bring to our understanding of universities and academic freedom? And then the last one is that I'm really enjoying doing some work on method that I've wanted to do for a long time. I'm working with a colleague of mine at the University of Melbourne, Lulu Weiss, and we have together founded a journal called Comparative Constitutional Studies, which we're looking just about to bring out its third volume. And one of the reasons that we wanted to establish a new journal was because we thought there's so much energy in the field. First of all, there's lots of great work to be published, but we also wanted to found a journal that paid particular attention to some of the understudied regions and less utilized methods, including discursive interpretive methods in constitutional law and constitutional theory. So that's the journal. And then we're also working together on method in constitutional law that comes out of this sort of shared interest that we have. And so we're working together on thinking about what does constitutional theory look like when it's done in a comparative context? What does comparative study bring to constitutional theory? And I guess we'd say that we are skeptical of the capacity or of the usefulness of attempting to theorize constitutionalism in a manner that is universal. We've written on this in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, and we're developing further work. And we think that we need to give much more careful attention to what constitutional theory is in a comparative context, what are the conditions of its success, and the level at which it's best performed. And so we're working towards an account of comparative constitutional theory that pitches it as a mid-level, neither highly particularistic nor fully universal. So that work, some of it has come out in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, some of it will be coming out in Gary Jacobson and Miguel Shaw's edited work on comparative constitutional theory, and then I suspect we'll take that a bit further. So that's the third piece of my research, and one very exciting thing that I'm working on. But can I say there'll be something else that will come up soon? There's so much happening in the world of constitutional law that I'm sure we will have new topics very shortly.
Thank you for sharing with us your plans for your future researches. And thank you for this interview, Professor Stone. Thank you for your time and for your generosity. It means a lot for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to talk to you.